Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. On Friday the 13th of October 1995, a sexual predator prowled the quiet city streets of Abbotsford, British Columbia. Two teenage girls were viciously attacked with a baseball bat. Tanya Smith died at the hands of their attacker, and Misty Cockrell only just survived, as she was driven by incredible fighting instinct and the will to live. Now, the only living eyewitness, Misty's life would remain in imminent danger. Through the Valley of the Shadow, by Inspector Rod Gale, is the true story of the manhunt for the Abbotsford killer. For 7 months, Inspector Gale and members of the Homicide Task Force found themselves drawn into a bizarre game of cat and mouse as the Abbotsford killer made taunting phone calls, sent messages bragging about his actions. He even desecrated the victim's gravestone and threatened to kill again. Would they catch the killer before he struck again? For the police, it was like chasing a shadow. For the communities involved, the Abbotsford killer was truly the shadow of death. Rod Gale, a retired Abbotsford police inspector who took the very first phone call from the killer back in 1995, is here to discuss his book on the case, Through the Valley of the Shadow, The Search for the Abbotsford Killer. Welcome to the program, and thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, Rod Gale.
Oh, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to expose the book.
Well, thank you very much, and I think your audience, the audience tonight, will really appreciate this story. It's not as well known as some of the others, but definitely one of the more incredible stories I've ever heard. Very, very interesting story. Now, you are a retired inspector, like I introduced you, so maybe you can give us a little bit on your background, especially as a police officer in homicide. How long had you worked investigating murder? And give us a little bit on your background, because I think obviously it is a very integral part of the story.
Sure. Yeah, I started my career in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1971, and I retired after 36 years of service. My last 26 years of service, though, were with the Abbotsford City Police in Abbotsford, British Columbia. And that's where I did most of my work as a homicide detective. I became involved in plainclothes work and the investigations of major crimes, and moved up from there to becoming the person in charge of the plainclothes sections on the homicide unit. And when this particular case happened, I was in charge of the plainclothes sections, and I was assigned to be in charge of the Homicide Task Force, which turned out to be a group of officers from 12 different police departments from across the lower mainland of British Columbia. And various police departments dedicated personnel to this, because this guy was such a threat to the various communities here around Vancouver. The various police departments saw the need to contribute personnel to help to catch him. So we had a task force of about 85 police officers from 12 different agencies working on this case for a period of just about 7 months, from the time that he first struck to the time that we actually made the arrest.
Now, tell our audience, for those that don't know, everyone knows where Vancouver, British Columbia is, but tell our audience where Abbotsford is in relation to the city of Vancouver, and how big is Abbotsford, and really, what kind of community is it?
Well, actually, Abbotsford's a suburb of the city of Vancouver now. It's located about 40 miles east of the city of Vancouver in what's called the Fraser Valley. The Fraser River Valley, where the Fraser River flows into the ocean, is pretty much where Vancouver is situated, and there's a big delta area that is various communities, and Abbotsford is one of the communities about 30 miles out. It's a farming community. It was traditionally first started up by Mennonite farmers, and there's a huge Dutch Mennonite population out in that area. It's actually known as the Bible Belt of the lower mainland of British Columbia because of all the churches per capita. And it's a very nice community to live in. So when I moved my family there myself, I really looked at it as being a nice, safe spot to live. And that was certainly disrupted when this whole business took place back in 1995 with the crimes that this individual was committing.
What year did you move to Abbotsford, by the way?
I actually came there myself in 1981 from Alberta. I was in the RCMP in Alberta and moved out to Abbotsford to join the city police force.
So you could say it was a part of the Bible Belt, what they consider the Bible Belt. So you were saying it, would you definitely sought this community out for its safety and its and just everything about that in terms of a great little quiet community to move your family to.
It was a lovely little rural, and still is. It's a lovely rural community of British Columbia. It's situated in the valley, surrounded by mountains. You have mountain views, even if you're down on the flat valley part. We're surrounded by mountains out here, and I still live in the neighboring community myself. I haven't moved very far away after I retired because it is a very nice place to live.
Now, the two most important people in this story, really, are Tanya Smith and Misty Cockrell. And to prepare our audience for the turn of events here and to fully explain what goes on, could you please tell us who Tanya Smith was? Give us a little bit of the background. 16 years old, I understand. Give us the background of Tanya Smith first, and then give us just the same kind of background on Misty Cockrell, if you could, to set up this story.
Well, actually, their backgrounds were very similar. They were a couple of local teenage girls that were high school students. They lived in the city of Abbotsford, and they were best friends. They were hanging out together. They had a large group of friends. Both of them were very attractive 16-year-old girls, and they had a wide circle of friends, and they enjoyed that from their high school and a circle of friends outside of their high school. And as a matter of fact, the evening that they were out, Friday the 13th, they were out visiting with friends. They'd been out to one party that they'd gone to over in the city of Surrey, which is a neighboring community, and they had come back and been dropped off at around midnight at Misty's house. And Misty's parents were not home, and they were supposed to be having a sleepover, so they figured, okay, well, we're going to take off and go and visit another friend who was still supposed to be having a birthday party. So they took off, and of course outside of curfew hours and stuff like that, but as teenage people do sometimes, they took off to go over and have this visit with these other friends, and they were walking on a well-lit street in the city, and in a fairly heavily populated area right behind what's known as the MSA Hospital. And it's a 4-lane road with sidewalks on both sides and well lighted with street lights, and that's where they were actually accosted by this individual that attacked them.
He apparently jumped out of the bushes after these young ladies, and he was armed with a baseball bat. Am I correct?
Yeah, he had been hiding in the bushes, and they had been walking down the street for quite some time. So we speculated that he had seen them and had got up ahead of them, hidden in the bushes and behind some cedar shrubs. And when they got up to where he was, he stepped out of the shrubs in front of them and said, "You bitches want a party?" And with that, he spread his arms and pushed the two girls through the bushes onto a sort of grassy knoll area in behind the cedar hedges, but on the back parking lot of an extended care unit of the hospital. And the unusual part about this was that the little grassy knoll area was also fairly well lighted in this back corner of the parking lot with windows looking out onto it. And that's where he actually told the girls to take off their clothes. And Tanya complied and Misty did not. And this fellow was going to proceed with sexually assaulting Tanya right there on the spot. And with that, he pushed her down onto the ground, and he got down on his knees himself, and at that point he put down the baseball bat. And that's the point at which Misty did something which was very unusual for a victim to do, because she had the opportunity there with this guy on his knees and in the process of taking down his pants and having put down the weapon, she could have run away.
Right.
But instead, she decided she was going to try and save her friend, and she picked up the baseball bat and she let him have it. She gave him a good hard stroke across the back, and he was up to his feet in a second, and he was able to deflect the second blow and catch the baseball bat. And that's at the point at which he beat them both unconscious. And that's where the story becomes a little bit hazy. Up to that point, we had a really good version of the story from Misty, who had survived this initial attack.
Well, let's find out what happened there. You say they were both knocked unconscious with the baseball bat, and there were several blows that he gave to these women as well. And You're saying he sexually assaulted Tanya Smith. Misty Cockrell, what happened after that? You say she survived, but what happened after that?
Well, I'll tell you, the way it first came to us at the police department, we didn't get the call until this happened shortly after midnight on October 14th, the early morning of October 14th, so the night of October 13th.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, just before the girls got to where this guy was standing, they were joking that they're going to run into a crazed killer tonight because it's Friday the 13th.
Wow.
And before they knew it, here's this guy standing in front of them. So it was just like, oh, my gosh. Yeah. And the next morning, at 5:30 in the morning, I received a phone call that woke me up, and it was our duty sergeant saying, this girl has just staggered into the MSA hospital, which was the hospital they were behind, into the emergency ward, and she's been badly, badly beaten. And she's saying her friend is still out there in the bush somewhere, and we got to go find her friend. And with that, of course, we dispatched teams of investigators to go to the hospital and to see what we could do, see what was going on. And when our investigators arrived there, they found that Misty Cockrell was still slipping in and out of consciousness, but she was a real fighter. She had significant injuries, broken arms, broken hand, caved-in skull in places, really a mess. And but she was still able to communicate and trying to get somebody out to save her friend. And she said that they'd been attacked by a man with a baseball bat, and that this guy was 7 feet tall. And initially, she even said that she knew his name, eh? And,
really?
It turned out to be. And then at one point, she said he was engaged to one of the nurses in the hospital in the emergency ward. So she was having some delusions along with the real stuff she was trying to tell us. So
sure.
We were trying to discern what was real and what was not, of course. And as it progressed, we got into her diary. We eventually got a hold of her mother. By this time, her mom was home and was, of course, worried about her. She came down to the hospital, and with the use of her diary and her day timer, we were able to determine that the Tanya that she was talking about was Tanya Smith. And by this time, we were rolling into 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And at the same time that this was happening, at a river about 10 miles outside of Abbotsford, east of us here, between the cities of Abbotsford and Chilliwack, the Vetter Canal, there was a fisherman. There was actually a lot of fishermen. There's a salmon run on the river at that time of the year. And there's a fisherman wading out of the river, and they found the body of Tanya Smith floating in the river. And that was phoned into the Chilliwack RCMP, who had officers attending. So the Chilliwack RCMP and officers from the Abbotsford Police were put it together pretty quick that these cases could be connected. And we were able to send an officer there with a high school yearbook picture of Tanya Smith and confirmed that, yes, that was her that was floating in the river. And from there, the investigation became a joint forces homicide investigation between ourselves and the Chilliwack RCMP, and they became our first partners in the investigation.
Now, Misty Cockrell was, you say in the beginning, she seemed to be deluded with the description of the perpetrator's height and that he was involved with the hospital nurse. Was there a point where she was lucid and you felt confident that whatever description she gave of the perpetrator obviously would be quite useful in drawing up a composite drawing? Did you get her to do that? And what was the result of that composite drawing in terms of when was it released, or what happened along the way from that point where she became lucid and she did contribute to composite drawing? What happened from there?
Yeah, actually, we were because of some of the non-lucid things that she said to us, we actually got an opinion from a doctor. The doctors were telling us, well, everything that she saw prior to the attack, she should be able to give you a pretty accurate account. So we thought, well, she's going to be able to give us a picture of this guy probably. So we had a composite artist work with her, and that composite artist developed a composite drawing. And because of the nature of the crime, we released that almost immediately. And it was a picture that showed a man with very, very thinning hair, a large, expansive forehead, wide set eyes, and sort of stringy hair, seedy looking sort of an individual. And she said he was very, very tall. And so we had this sort of description of him that we did release early on in the case. And after that had been released, we also got a phone call that several weeks later, we got a phone call from an individual who said he was a composite artist, and his name was Robert Exter. And Exter had been one of the original Unabomber artists, the one that did the hooded drawing of the Unabomber in the first instance.
Right.
And he said he was a portrait artist as well as a composite artist. He said, there's a couple things about the drawing that was done that he thought he could improve on, because he was a portrait artist, and he says the facial proportions of that were sort of a little bit cartoon-like. They were a little bit caricature-like, as opposed to being in proper dimensions with what normal features or we consider normal features are. So he volunteered to come and work with Misty, and he did, and she produced another drawing with him. As it turned out, her drawings, neither of them ultimately ended up matching the individual we were looking. We ended up arresting in this case, though, and it turned out that her memory of this person's face was skewed in as much as she could tell it to a composite artist. She ultimately did feel that she had recognized the individual when it came time for the court case, but that was too late down the road to be of much evidentiary value.
Now, once you had this composite drawing, you've done the two drawings now, and you're even more confident that you have as good evidence as you can to proceed. At least you have a lead. You have this person's face from an eyewitness. Now, what happens after that? You've put out this lead.
Well,
what is it?
Well, actually, we had more evidence than just that. We also had an autopsy done early on in the case, and we were able to determine at the autopsy that there was seminal fluid left of the body of Danielle Smith, and we were able to get a DNA profile from that. And there was also a bite mark left on the right nipple of her breast, which came from the perpetrator, and we held that back as holdback evidence, because nobody would have known about that. It wasn't quickly discernible to persons other than at the autopsy. They were able to see this when they examined her. So we had those two things in our case book that were items that would allow us to help identify the bite mark, and a DNA profile were very good evidence. So we use those as part of our locker of evidence to identify suspects or eliminate suspects. But the composite drawing was something that we used to generate tips and to say, hey, here's what this person might look like. And then as this was proceeding, we no sooner had the DNA profile than we got a phone call from an individual, and he said, because we were still looking for the location where the attack had actually happened.
Right.
And in the phone call, I was the one that actually answered it, and he said, on a walkway that runs north and south on a grassy knoll behind trees. And I said, well, where are you getting this from? And he says, well, I'm the killer. Tanya's right nipple tasted really good. So there's a real shocker of a phone call, because, of course, he's giving us the holdback evidence. And for him to know the significance of a holdback evidence and to give it like that was just, who is this person, and where is he coming from? How did he get this? And so it was very, very shocking. And then right after that phone call was received, we of course sent cars out we traced it to where the phone call had come from, and we went to a local park where they had used a phone booth next to a park, and we were dusting for prints there and talking to people, seeing if anybody saw anybody at the phone booth. And about an hour after that, or an hour and a half after that, we received another two phone calls in quick succession, and one of them saying, I'll be driving around looking for someone else. just in case you wonder who I am, her right nipple tasted really good. And, do you think I'd be stupid enough to leave fingerprints behind when I make a phone call? Because he saw us dusting for prints. So he was obviously there in the area at the time that dusting for the fingerprints. So this individual suddenly became somebody that went from being somebody that had committed a murder now to somebody that had committed a murder and was threatening to kill again and was taunting us and was playing a game, which was very scary because, sometimes murders happen and the individual becomes scared or remorseful and they'll come out and admit to it. But this guy was having fun with it. He was enjoying what he'd done. And we ended up getting a psychological profile done on that aspect of him right away because we were concerned, who does this kind of stuff, eh?
Yeah, I was going to ask you. I was going to say you must have. I know that the RCMP and even the OPP in Ontario have a unit, like a very similar unit to BSU, and the FBI trains officers to be able to do this psychological criminal profiling. Yeah. So I was going to ask you, at what point was it immediate that you consulted some of these profiling experts? Because this guy sure fits a serial killer profile, really. Absolutely. And we did consult with them right away because we were concerned, what kind of an individual does this? Of course, you want to get the profile. Psychological profiling is done based on the premise that they've interviewed hundreds of killers, and they use the information that they've received from those people to sort of extrapolate what they're like and who they're like and what are their characteristics. And so then they look for those characteristics and evidence of those characteristics in individuals, and they're able to say, okay, this guy could be unemployed, 30, married, unmarried, whatever, right? Those sort of things. And they can give you a rough idea of what the individual might be like. This guy, though, because there aren't that many serial killers that make phone calls and taunt like this, they couldn't give us a real super accurate profile of him. But they were able to help us a lot. The profilers were able to give us a lot of assistance because we eventually started using the media to try and manipulate him a little bit, to try and catch him at one point. We actually had an investigative strategy we called Operation Mousetrap, where we tried to stimulate him to make a phone call because he was using phone booths to make his phone calls. And we wanted to see if we could catch him at a phone booth after making a phone call. So we wanted to stimulate a phone call and say something that would stimulate him to phone but not to go out and kill again. So we wanted to do something that was going to be challenging but not threatening or aggravating to the point where he says, "What the heck with you? I'll show you I'm still around. I'll kill somebody again." Eh? So where did you get the strategy from? Where did it emanate from? Was it from discussions? Was it sort of a think tank, or was it directly? We had sort of a think tank on the team, and we talked about what kind of things do we do, and how can we do this, and what's the best way to catch somebody like this? What does he like doing? Where is he exposing himself? And where the biggest opportunity where he's stepping out and exposing himself is every time he made a phone call. He created a new opportunity. But when he was making the phone calls, his time at the phone booth was so limited. It was seconds, eh? So we had to actually develop a strategy where we could improve on that. So we got the local phone company to set us up in a way that when our 911 operators got a phone call from a phone booth, a 911 call from a phone booth, they could see it was coming from a phone booth and which phone booth it was coming from before they'd answered it, and they could start a car off dispatched to that location before they even answered the phone. So we were able to buy ourselves a few seconds of driving time that way, and then we gridded off every phone booth in the municipality, and we had static surveillance points set up so that there was no phone booth that we had to get to that was more than a minute or two from a surveillance point. So we were trying to hedge our bets, and then we ran this media strategy where we tempted him to call again. What did you exactly say? How did you go about it? Tell us the process. I think it's very interesting that you could get the full cooperation from a newspaper as well. Well, that was the unusual part because the media are not always that anxious to help out. I mean, they helped out 100% in this one. They could see that it was a threat to their community, and they were very anxious to give us a hand too. But what we asked them to do was actually deceptive because we were going to be doing something that was going to try and
promote this guy to talk, to do something again, we said, you got to run this article exactly the way it's written. Don't change the wording, because we didn't want them saying something that would incite this guy to go and kill again. Eh?
Right.
Just say it the way it is. And then we picked Dr. Mike Webster, who was a local psychologist, and Mike had been asked to comment on these things before, and it appeared that this guy had responded prior to one of Mike's comments, so it looked like he'd be a good guy to deliver the message.
What do you mean? Sorry. What did you mean he had responded to some of his earlier comments? It looked
like one of the phone calls he'd made had come on the heels of a comment that after Mike Webster had made a comment in the paper at one point.
I see. Okay.
He made another phone call. So the message that was published by Mike in the paper, he was asked by the media, because there had been a long absence of contacts from this individual, and he was asked, "Do you think what do you think's going on here?" And he says, "Well, I think deep down inside he knows that every time he makes a phone call, he's putting himself in jeopardy of being caught, and he's smart enough to know that that his survival depends on him not calling, and I think that he's afraid to call a little bit, and this is making him afraid to call, and that's what's happened here. In other words, you're being a little bit of a chicken. You're not making phone calls anymore because you're scared to, eh?" So that was sort of the challenge that was put out to him. And after the challenge was put out, we ran surveillance steady on the phone booths for a couple 3 days, and no response. He didn't make a phone call after that. And then a few days later, there was a response, in as much as there was a theft of the headstone off of Tanya Smith's grave, and it was written all over. It was scribbled all over with threats. Next time, Misty, and that sort of thing. She wasn't the first. She won't be the last. And the headstone was left on the hood of a radio station vehicle in the middle of a parking lot right next to a restaurant. It was about a 160-pound, 180-pound headstone put on the hood of this car right next to a restaurant. Talk about high-risk activity.
Sure.
And nobody saw him. That's why in the book I compared this guy to a shadow, because he was there. We knew he had to have been there, but nobody saw him. At the phone booth, nobody saw him. So we were starting to think, he's got to be very, very cool to, cool operator, and very stealthy to be able to do this sort of stuff. Nobody sees him. He picks his exact time to make his move, doesn't, gets out, eh? So anyway,
did he call? Sorry, did he call the radio station and inform them, or did he call 911 again? And
no, actually, on that occasion, he never called 911 again. At that point, he called the radio station, and he says, "Go look out in the hood of the Radio Max car." And the station operator went out and had a look and saw it was the headstone of Tanya Smith, and knew what it was right away, because it was always obviously big news in our community.
Sure.
And so he called that in, and we had officers down there, and the thing was being investigated, and so on. So it was quite a carry on.
So what did you do with the potential threat to Misty Cockrell? How serious did you and your department take that threat, and as a result, what plans did you put into motion concerning Misty Cockrell?
That was a big deal for us. It was a big deal for Misty too, because she was in the hospital. She was undergoing surgery on her head because she had to have holes drilled in her skull to let the pressure off her brain, because she was had internal bleeding and broken arms, and so she was in the hospital for a significant time. And the whole time she was there, she was the only living witness to a homicide. So we had her under armed guard the entire time that she was there. Right. And then when she eventually did come out of hospital, we put her entire family into witness protection, and she was ferried around from one part of the province of BC to the other, and hidden away in various places so that this person could not get to her. And it was quite an ordeal for her, and she had a younger sister and her mom and dad, and they went through it. They were actually very, very good sports about it, and I'm still in touch with them to this day, and they are they still say, wow, that was one of the most horrible things they ever had to go through, because of course they were waiting for this person to get caught. Would he ever get caught? When could they come out of hiding? A constant threat to their daughter and to their whole family, actually. And it was pretty tough for them.
Now, what was your reaction when you try to bait this killer and he comes out, and definitely your efforts are rewarded by this guy contacting you indirectly, albeit, but he still contacts you. Now, what is your reaction? What is your thought about the plan that you've put ahead? Are you happy with the success, or are you obviously you got to put these people in witness protection program? That's unsettling for the victim of this crime.
Yeah, and I mean the witness protection program was connected to him obviously and the threat that he posed, but our communication with him wouldn't have mattered one way or the other. We would have had them in witness protection regardless.
Okay.
The fact that he was making the phone calls and things like that and continuing to be a threat to the entire community was very concerning and very disconcerting. And the way that he continued to communicate and continued to taunt and carry on was very, very disconcerting for everybody. Everybody that heard what was going on had the same fear. This guy's going to kill again, and he's genuinely off center. Like this is not somebody that's thinking in a rational way. He's enjoying what he's doing. He's getting really perverse pleasure out of this communication. As a matter of fact, the psychologist we talked to said that in one way it was good that he was doing this because he was getting some satisfaction out of making these phone calls.
Some release.
And, some sort of a release, and it was a sort of satisfaction. He says as long as he's getting his jollies like this, it might inhibit him from going out and killing again. This might be enough for him for a while to be this sort of center of attention this way, because he obviously liked the attention that he was getting from all the media, and he by this time he'd been dubbed the Abbotsford Killer, so he even had his own brand name, if you will.
Right. Did he know? Did he know specifically who you were, and did he refer to you by name, or was there any indication he didn't know that? He just
no, he didn't. He didn't associate with any of us at a personal level. It was him versus sort of the police in general. And when he finally one of his next stunts was to actually write a letter to us and tape that letter to a wrench and throw it through the front window of a house in Abbotsford at around 8 o'clock one night, and just picked a house at random and threw it through their front living room window, smashed the window. It was a young mother home with her kids, and she found this, and the letter said on it, "Abby Killer, call 911." Had directions on it for her, and so she phoned, of course, and our officers went there, recognized it was another communication right away, and handled it properly, brought it back to be identified or examined by our identification forensic people. And in the meantime, they also went through the area and see if anybody saw anything. And again, this guy's a ghost. Nobody saw him. And brought the envelope and the wrench back to the office. It had been taped. It was a clenching wrench, and it had been taped to a blue envelope. And inside the blue envelope was a letter that he had written, along with some newspaper articles. And the newspaper articles included pictures of Misty and Tanya from the newspaper. But they also included pictures of 3 women who were murdered in 1985 in Vancouver. And all 3 of them had been murdered in a very similar way, stabbings. And they were also stranger-type homicides, sexually motivated type homicides, unsolved killings. And these 3 pictures that were put in had come from a 1989 edition of the Vancouver Sun. So he'd been saving these pictures since 1989 somewhere. The pictures of Misty and Tanya were from fairly recent issues of our local papers. But so this guy, and in his letter, he referred to his other conquests. Here's some of my other conquests. And then he talked about, he says, I'm surprised you haven't clued into others that I've done. And then he referenced 3 attacks on women, 3 other sexual assaults on women in Abbotsford that he described and he was claiming credit for. And they were very well described, well enough described that we were able to find them in our files and look at them and say, yeah, these are the ones he's talking about. One in particular had happened only 3 months before Misty and Tanya were attacked. Okay. That happened in front of the MSA hospital, and this woman had been knocked unconscious obviously hit with a blunt object. She said it was a baseball bat, and he's actually said, hey, that's the same bat that I used on Misty and Tanya.
Wow.
And I stole that woman's purse, and I threw it on top of the old brick building. And as it turned out, the lady's purse had been found on top of the old brick building several months after the attack, or a couple months after the attack had taken place. So he had all the details down on that particular attack and on two others. One was the attempted abduction of a young 12-year-old girl across from McDonald's in broad daylight. And the other one was the attack of a woman that was leaving a halfway house, and she was punched in the head and knocked unconscious. He was dragging her away, and a car came along, and he dropped her and ran away. And those were both confirmed as incidents that had taken place. So he was a busy guy. He was doing all sorts of these kind of crimes. These are opportunistic type of crimes, where he looks for an opportunity to step in, do something, try and get away with it. If it doesn't work, run away. And he had been obviously quite successful.
Now the information you got from this note, especially about the 3 unsolved murders in Vancouver, were you able? Did he give you? You just had mentioned that he gave you sufficient evidence or background information to say that he was a likely perpetrator in the 3 sexual assaults in Abbotsford. So you believe him with that part of the story. What about the 3 murders in Vancouver? Were you able to get any background detail that would corroborate what he had said? Did you take the DNA sample and put it through the data system, the data bank, and check it against? You already had a DNA sample, you said, and so
we had DNA samples, but unfortunately, these 3 homicides did not have any DNA.
Okay.
And they were from 1985, and 1985 was a pre-DNA era. I mean,
sure.
a lot of leftover. There were homicides from the 85 era that had leftover blood samples and semen samples that they were profiling DNA on, but these were not among them. So we had 3 murders that he was sort of intimating, and he didn't come right out and say, "Hey, I did these, and here's some hidden facts." Which, if he'd given some of the hidden facts or some holdback on one of them, that would have been a critical piece, but he didn't. So they were looked at. He was looked at as a possible suspect in them, and remains a possible suspect on those 3 homicides to this day. And those are 3 that may never be solved, because you deal with the critical need for physical evidence, and sometimes it's not there. So.
Now, what is your next step? Once you have all this information, he sent you this threatening note. You did say that your forensic team does discover something. It ends up being his crucial mistake. Tell us why this contact with police, this time, why it was his fatal mistake.
Well, it was a real turning point for our investigation, because he was obviously quite proud of the fact that he was careful about leaving his fingerprints behind. He said, "Do you think I'd be stupid enough to leave fingerprints behind when I make a phone call?" And in fact, we weren't finding fingerprints on any of the phone booths or any of that stuff. So here we had a situation where this individual was very conscious of his fingerprints. But on this particular note, our forensic person was very, very clever, and he took apart the tape that held the note together. He took it apart layer by layer, and on the back side, on the sticky side of one of the pieces of tape, he actually found a fingerprint. And it was a remarkable fingerprint. It was like almost an entire whole fingerprint, which made it searchable against the national database in Canada and in the United States. And with that, we thought, wow, we've got him now. I mean, because we thought this guy, and our psychological profilers had said to us too, this guy he's been around. He's probably had contact. He's probably going to have a criminal record of some kind.
Right.
And we ran him, and he didn't. There was no criminal record, no previous fingerprinting of the individual. So
wow.
Here we now have an individual that has never been fingerprinted, and he's doesn't have a criminal record in the Canadian system or the American system. So we have to turn our whole investigation on its nose and say, okay, all the people before, I mean, previously convicted sexual predators and previously convicted people that do that kind of an assault and stalking are now, that's a way of eliminating it. If you have a record, you're now eliminated. And we're now looking for somebody that has no record at all.
Wow.
And that became sort of a scary part again, because that could be anybody in the community. That could be any good Joe, and again, making him that much more invisible again to our investigation. And so we were rolling in evidence. We had tons of evidence. We just needed to be pointed at the right individual to do this, to who was doing this. And we had started a strategy early on in the investigation after the phone calls came in. Within a few weeks of the phone calls coming in, we decided that we were going to release voice tapes of those phone calls and ask people, do you recognize it? Just like, when a good friend calls up or somebody that you know well, you don't have to ask who that is. You recognize their voice immediately. We were hoping to get that response that somebody would say, hey, I know who that is, and by playing it over the radio. And that never happened right away. So we went on for months playing these tapes and running them back and forth through the media. And we even had a call-in line where people could phone in and listen to tapes as many times as they wanted. A 1-800 number. They could listen to the tape all day if they wanted. And so we were doing that as well, trying to get somebody to identify it. So we had, that way we were generating tips. We had people that were calling and say, hey, I think it sounds a little bit like so-and-so,
Right.
And eventually, when the time came, we decided we were going to do another media strategy in April of 1996, because things had started to slow down a little bit, and we had a whole lot of other information now from these other cases. So we wanted to do a really comprehensive media strategy, talk about some of the other cases, talk about some of the new descriptions we had of him, because we now had other people that had also seen him, albeit briefly. And we had a couple of vehicle descriptions of a Pontiac sedan, or a sedan-type vehicle that we thought could be our suspect vehicle. So we had these things to share now. So we also had the tapes enhanced. One of our investigators got it in his head that, there's a lot of white noise there. I bet you I could get that cleaned up. So he took it to a sound lab and got them to get the white noise out, which really helped enunciate the voice, make it much more clear.
Right.
And so we had re-edited the tapes, and we re-released them. And that happened on April 30th of 1996. And that same afternoon, we got phone calls. We got a phone call from a woman identifying herself. She says, I know that voice, that's my son. And he fishes at the Vedder River where the girl's body was dropped. And he actually went to her funeral. He'd gone to the girl's funeral.
She told you that?
Yeah.
Wow.
And ultimately we had this individual identified as, and his name was Terry Driver, and he was the son of a retired police officer.
Okay.
And a decorated police officer. And he was living in our community. He worked as a printer. He was a married man with 2 kids. And so no criminal record. And when we tried to do what we called our cold approach on him, which was to go and knock on his door and say, hey, somebody pointed you out as possibly being a suspect in this. We'd like you to come in and give your DNA and fingerprints and stuff. He refused. And our investigators who were at the scene thought, yeah, his voice sounds pretty good. His own mother thought it sounded exactly like it. And with the other pieces that we had, with the, fishing at the Vedder River and having gone to the funeral, we were very suspicious of him.
And what did you do from there? Did you put him under surveillance? You obviously didn't have enough. Did you have enough for a warrant?
We had enough for a warrant to go. We were getting warrants to go and search his business premises, where he was a printer, and we were able to get his records for when he was at work, and we were able to determine that he was not at work. He had punched out of work during the critical times when some of the phone calls were made.
Right.
And found out that he was a fisherman at the Vedder Canal, that he had used that particular area of the Vedder Canal. He had a sedan that fit the description of the vehicle that we were looking for, a brown sedan. And so we stayed on him, and all this checking that was going on was very annoying to him. His own family were putting pressure on him to go in and go get this cleared up. If you're not the guy, go and clear it up. So eventually we got a call from his lawyer, and his lawyer said, look, my client wants to come in and get this cleared up. He's not going to give you any DNA, but he'll give you fingerprints, and on the condition that you take his fingerprints, and after you compare them, they get ripped up and thrown away, because he doesn't want you guys, he doesn't trust the cops. He doesn't want you guys to have his fingerprints. So, of course, we agreed to that. And him and his lawyer came into the police office, and his fingerprints were taken. And I guess he really thought that he had been careful enough that he hadn't left any fingerprints behind. He didn't know about the piece of tape. And we hadn't told anybody where we got it from, the fingerprint that we had. And we did the comparison, and it was him. And he never left the police station after that day. He was arrested on the spot. And, of course, the DNA profiles were done, and the bite mark profile were done and found to be him. And the DNA profile was found to be him up to a likelihood of 1 in 17 trillion, I think it was, or 1 in 1.7 trillion. So pretty high odds.
Sure.
And so that was the evidence that we had to go to court with, along with his own mother identifying his voice on the tape.
Wasn't his brother involved as well, Don Driver, and took collected the reward?
Actually identified his voice as well, and eventually the family came to believe and adopt his story, because he came up with a defense later on that he in fact was not the killer, and one of the girls had actually been attacked by somebody that he'd seen running from the scene.
Sure.
And he got up in court eventually and testified that he was driving down the street doing what he called scanner chasing, which was going out at night and listening to the police scanner and driving around watching the police go to various calls and helping them out if he could. He was sort of a wannabe cop.
Sure.
And on the night in question, that's what he had been doing. And he had ended up over in the area where the girls were attacked, and he was driving down that street, and he saw a male come out of the bushes and run across the road and jump over the fence, and that made him suspicious, so he stopped and went and looked through those bushes. And when he saw the two girls there, one of them being Tanya, was nude, and he immediately thought he'd go and call for help, but then he thought better of it, and he decided he was going to have sex with this unconscious girl, and which he did. And then he thought she died because she had some spasms when he was having sex with her, and he thought she had died, so he put the body in the trunk of his car and took it to the Vetter Canal. And he said he also put Misty in the front of his car and took her to the front of the hospital where he dropped her off. But she said that that's not true, and there was no blood ever found in the front of his car to corroborate that. So, but he got up and actually testified in court in his own defense that that's what had happened.
Sure. Obviously, the judge didn't refer to his story as a fantastic story and implausible. Didn't believe him. Obviously, there was no merit to his story. Tell us a little bit about Misty Cockrell, and this is quite the story. This 16-year-old, this little, she wasn't really a big woman, fighting for her life, escaping, even though she had the gaping head wound. A real fighter. Tell us a little bit about her appearance at the trial and your appearance at the trial as well. Just give us a little bit of that, because I thought it was a real interesting aspect of your story.
Yeah, well, she's an amazing young woman. She's a fighter right from day one, and she is one of these people that, although she was a victim, she refuses to be seen. She doesn't want to be seen in the role of a victim. She's a survivor, and she survived this, and she fought her way through it, and she got up in court and pointed this guy out at the preliminary hearing, and she got up at the trial and pointed him out again and gave her story and told the story. And for a 16-year-old, she was 16 when this happened, and she was 18 by the time the trial took place 2 years later. And just a really, really strong young individual, and very, very focused. And this was her best friend that was murdered, and she'd gone through a lot of people, and this is being a human being. This is a hard thing to take. Like I've seen murder victims before and survivors of these kind of attacks, and it's very, very difficult for people to get over. And she was a shining example of the survivor. And now she speaks for civil rights, or for victims of violence and violence against women. And she's actually received a scholarship from the Canadian Crime Victim Foundation. And the foundation, I'm one of the directors of that foundation, too, because of, when I saw what they were doing and the support that they gave to Misty, it's a privately funded foundation that provides scholarship money for survivors of violent crime. And it's based on the fact that a criminal could go to jail and receive an education while they're in jail, but there's no kind of funding like that for victims of crime. So this foundation, our Canadian Crime Victim Foundation, is seeking to create a balance there and provide that. So Misty has had her education paid for. She went through her schooling. She's just graduating this year. And as she was looking at actually becoming, of all things, a parole officer, a probation officer, and it looks like now she might go into teaching. She's now a young mother herself. She's got two kids, and still, worked her way through school. And she's not without residual problems from her injury. She still has side effects from these injuries, but she doesn't let them get to her, or not visibly anyway, and she speaks at our Canadian Crime Victim Foundation fundraisers, and she's really quite a remarkable individual. She was part of the permission process when I wrote this book. The book was written in honor of Misty and Tanya, and it was written to support victims of crime. So the funds from the book don't come to profits don't come to me. Profits are being donated back to the Canadian Crime Victim Foundation and to the Abbotsford Victims Services Foundation. So what we're trying to do here is make something out of the story. The story got a lot of notoriety, and there's actually been 4 documentaries done on this case since it happened, and they're 1-hour crime documentaries. And it just occurred to me that there's no money that ever came back to victims of crime out of that. And it's such an interesting story that I just thought it was a really neat opportunity to tell it, and tell it from the police perspective. Because the other thing about this is I couldn't be more proud of the team of police officers that I worked with. These guys were great. And there were people that put their lives on hold for 7 months while this case went on in order to get it done and to make it work. So it was really quite a feat, and the police agencies working together cooperatively like that, it was quite a feat. So there was a lot to be said about it that I wanted to get in there and make the public aware of and tell a story. So that's sort of where it comes from. So Misty continues to work for victims' rights, and we're friends to this day. And her family, as they've recovered from their about with the whole thing. It's a difficult thing for other families. The family of Tanya Smith, that they've lost a daughter that will never be back. And it's a very, very hard thing for any family to deal with, losing a family member like that, and the insult added to the injury with the insulting way this individual behaved against everybody was just disgusting beyond. The story he told was disgusting beyond belief. So.
Yes. What's an interesting thing about this story is that there is, again, the happy ending with Misty Cockrell to a certain degree. Obviously, the Tanya Smith family is never going to recover. And Misty Cockrell is just a unique individual to be able to pick herself up and brush herself off and continue. But the interesting thing, because I've covered a lot of these books and read so many true crime books, that the police usually come across lots of times, and not so purposely in the book, but lots of times they miss leads, go down the wrong road, or just take a long time and not make all the necessary right moves. In this particular case, you guys really can give yourself guys credit for doing the right things at the right time and achieving the best possible resolution in a short period of time, relatively short period of time. I'm sure the city of Abbotsford was relieved, and you do really describe the terror that gripped the city during that 7-month period. But you did take this serial killer off the street, basically, and put him away forever. He's been deemed a dangerous offender. You can't get any better in Canada. So,
no, that's right. He'll be away for hopefully the rest of his natural life, and that's a good thing. That's where he needs to be.
Well, it's the very least that should happen. I think the thing is that for our American audience, we do have a a little different system, even though that the legal system is based on the same system. But we do have a little, as you know, it's fairly difficult to put someone behind bars for the rest of their life with no actual, per se, life sentence. So it is interesting that you were able, one way or another, through this person's narcissism and need to be famous, that through the techniques, the criminal profiling and the the walking the beat and doing the necessary canvassing, all the work, the hard work and the work you did with the psychological profiling to be able to capture this individual was all work that was energy well spent to come to this conclusion. So it's a great story of success in light of a very disastrous situation, and it's a great story. With that, I'd like to let people know, basically you can tell us about the Canadian Crime Victims Foundation, how they can contact that organization. Maybe you have a website, or we can repeat that information, and also tell our audience where the best place to get your book as fast as possible and get it from the publisher. Maybe you can give us a little bit of that information, please.
You bet, yeah. The Canadian Crime Victim Foundation, you can visit our website. It's CCVF, Canadian Crime Victim Foundation.net, CCVF.net, and we take donations over the internet, and or just visit and see what we're about. It's a very interesting concept to get the balance. My book, and again, my profits go all to victims of crime, is available through Tate Publishing Company, TATE Publishing, out of Oklahoma, and the book can also be purchased through Amazon.com, and it's, again, titled Through the Valley of the Shadow, The Search for the Abbotsford Killer, and by Rod Gale. Last name is spelled Gehl. So there's lots of different ways to search for it, but if you type in Abbotsford Killer, it'll come up right away. Right.
Now, what was the effect of this? We've got about 3 minutes, so maybe you can just tell us what was the effect for? I know you're a cop at first. You're an inspector. You're a policeman at heart, but you became an author. I understand the motivation for writing this book, but what was the overall effect for you? Was it positive? Was it negative? Tell us about your overall conclusion after doing all the research, going through the trial, living, pretty well, very, very close to the killer himself. Tell us about your overall experience.
Well, and I think every cop that worked on this case will tell you the same thing. It was a huge feeling of relief when we caught him, when we finally brought it to a conclusion, and there was another huge feeling of relief when he was convicted. So we had several high points in the investigation, and a number of points where we sat back and wondered, oh my God, is he gonna kill somebody? Are we not doing everything we can to get him? So there was a big feeling of responsibility to the community too. Like everybody that worked on the case felt this. Like we've got to get this person. He's out there. He's very, very dangerous. And it wasn't any kind of Hollywood fantastic kind of made up thing. These were genuine feelings that people had, and it showed. It really showed when the whole thing came down that people were emotionally charged. And I remember the day that we caught the guy, and we called the investigators in off the street. We're talking about seasoned cops, saying people coming in with tears in their eyes. So yeah, that tells you something.
Yeah, it's a great story, too, for the community of Abbotsford. I'm sure it will be a legendary story about really the whole community getting together, finding this guy and locking him away forever, making sure that he could never inflict any more pain and sorrow on anyone else. It's incredible.
Yeah, and it was truly a community pull together as well, in as much as the community responded in a way that people were walking each other to their cars, people were being very careful about not letting their kids out at night. And I think that to a great extent that eliminated the opportunity victims that he had normally been preying on.
Right.
So if he was out there looking, chances are that he wasn't seeing the opportunities that he normally would have seen in a community that had not been so sensitized. And he was responsible for creating that sensitivity himself, so it's a little bit of a paradox there. But,
yeah, sure. It's ironic, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you very much, Rod Gale, for a great book, Through the Valley of the Shadow, The Search for the Abbotsford Killer, by Rod Gale. And thank you very much for a very, very informative interview. And I want to say thank you for agreeing to this interview, and have yourself a great evening.
Oh, thank you very much.
I wish you the best of luck, and you have yourself a good evening.
I will, sir. Thank you very much, too. Bye-bye.
Good night. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zupansky. Good evening.